It's Wednesday, the 9th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour MP Emma Lewell-Buck, John Stevens of the Daily Mirror and John Longworth, formerly of the pro-Brexit campaign Leave Means Leave. He now chairs the Independence Business Network. Today,
it's always sad to lose a colleague, and particularly in these kind of circumstances. You know, these are people with families, etc. So I think there is, you know, nobody takes any glee when these things happen.
Why was Gavin Williamson brought back in? Why is Suella Braverman still in the government? And this is an indication that the Prime Minister is weak. He's in number 10, but he's not really in control.
After just 14 days in the job, Rishi Sunak loses his Cabinet Office Minister over accusations of bullying and intimidation. The Prime Minister faces Keir Starmer at noon. We'll bring you that live, of course.
I'd like to welcome the fake news media, which is back there. Actually, they were hoping for big losses, but that's not happening.
But are things going Donald Trump's way in the US midterm elections?
Certainly when it becomes sexist, racist, over-sexualised.
3,000 abusive tweets are sent to MPs every day, a BBC investigation reveals. Will Twitter's new owner clean things up or make them worse? Let's start with Gavin Williamson. Sacked twice before as a minister, he has now resigned. It happened last night as two investigations are underway into accusations of bullying. Let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Mail. Williamson forced out in cut-your-throat bully row. He denies any wrongdoing. But my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Matt, is what does it say about Rishi Sunak's control of the party?
Well, I think Gavin's made the right call because it had clearly become a distraction. But ultimately, for me, the Prime Minister is someone who has, throughout his time in government, really made the right decisions, whether that is backing people throughout the furlough scheme, all of that stuff. For me, all of this stuff comes back to that judgment question. And I see a huge amount of evidence that that is someone who has got those decisions right.
But what does it say? But my question was, what does it say about his control of the party? As you say, Gavin Williamson resigned. Should he have been sacked?
Well, I'll answer your first question first. You saw, I think, the party resoundingly get behind Rishi in that leadership contest. He still, of course, retains that control because people saw someone who was the right person to do the job.
What does it say about Rishi Sunak's control of the party?
Well, I mean, really, at the start of this week, the Prime Minister said that he had full confidence. He already knew about some of these allegations.
About a complaint against Gavin Williamson.
About the complaints against Gavin. Then, when he resigned yesterday, the Prime Minister said he accepted his resignation with great sadness. What happened to this integrity, professionalism and accountability that the Prime Minister promised? It's he's a weak leader. This is absolutely ridiculous. He should have sacked him as soon as he knew about those allegations. And there's another question here is, what does the Prime Minister know and how long has he known about these other allegations and what on earth did he do about it? Because it looks like he did nothing until they became public.
What do you think it says, John, about Rishi Sunak's control of the party? Because it's clear that some of the briefing, some of it out in the open, is from other ministers or former ministers, which makes it harder, doesn't it, for Rishi Sunak to keep control and govern?
Yeah, I think it shows that you have got the warring different sides of the Tory party. Yes, a lot of Tory MPs did back Rishi Sunak, but there were a lot of people who supported Boris Johnson, who supported Liz Truss, who were quite cheesed off that Boris Johnson got kicked out, that Liz Truss got kicked out, and now think, well, hang on a minute, Rishi Sunak can have a bit of that medicine too. And I think it is quite problematic for Rishi Sunak. As Emma said, that first speech he gave as Prime Minister, within minutes of becoming Prime Minister, he said those words about integrity, accountability, professionalism, and then just a few hours later, he hired these ministers. Suella Braverman, he knew that she'd been sacked 6 days previously, and Gavin Williamson, he knew that there was an outstanding bullying complaint against him, And the reason I think this is really tricky for Rishi Sunak is he was meant to be this new broom. People were saying under Liz Truss that the Tories were tired, that after 12 years in power, maybe they deserved to be in opposition. The whole point of Rishi Sunak was he was meant to be there to clean things up, show that things were kind of back on the road again. And we've just had 2 weeks, his first 2 weeks of Prime Minister, rather than a honeymoon, it's 2 weeks of constant scandals about his ministers.
What do you think, John Longworth?
I'm always astonished, really, that there are two sections of society, of public life, show business and politics. Actually, there's not much difference between the two, is there really, these days? Show business and politics, where the normal rules don't seem to apply about behaviour and the way in which people who are employed are dealt with. So I think it runs much deeper than the Prime Minister. I think it's to do with the culture and the way in which the rules are set. I mean, nowhere in business would the behaviour of politicians be tolerated.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the behaviour and some of the abuse, of course, that MPs receive later on in the programme. But let's talk about the midterm elections in the United States. There isn't a full set of results. There may not be for quite a few days or possibly weeks. These are important elections for both parts of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Of course, we're 2 years away from a presidential election. But let's talk to our correspondent in Washington, David Willis. Hello to you. David, there was talk of a red Republican wave. That doesn't seem to have materialised. There seems to be more optimism amongst Democrats there. But why are these elections important in terms of Joe Biden's ability to govern over the next few years?
Well, they're vitally important, Joe. The simple reason being that without the support of his own party in both houses, there's very little by way of legislation that Joe Biden can hope to get through and get on the statute book. What we appear to be confronting or looking at right now is the Republicans retaking control of the lower house, the House of Representatives, but the Senate race is still too close to call. The only seat to change hands in the Senate so far is the one in Pennsylvania, and that has gone to the Democrats. The hoodie-wearing, tattooed John Fetterman trouncing the Trump-endorsed rival Mehmet Oz in that race. So now it all comes down to other swing states such as Georgia, Arizona and Nevada, and it could be quite some time before we know who has the power in the Congress and particularly in the Senate, for the simple reason that the state of Georgia has gone to a runoff, and that's not due to take place for at least another 4 weeks, Joe.
Right, so we could be waiting quite a long time. What about in terms of a sort of potential platform for those wanting to throw their hats into the ring for the presidency?
Well, the very fact that Trump-endorsed candidates have underperformed in many of the races. We talked about Mehmet Oz. He's one example of that, handpicked by Donald Trump. Might, some suggest, open the door to other candidates throwing their hat into the ring to compete with Donald Trump for the Republican presidential nomination. Mr. Trump has promised a special announcement, as he puts it, in a week's time, and that's likely to be the formal announcement that he is running for the White House for a third time. But we saw the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, do extremely well tonight. He expanded his lead there in Florida, and he is a favourite, a darling of the conservative sect, if you like. There are a lot of people who would like to see him challenge Donald Trump for the presidency. He's seen as Trump with less of the drama.
David Willis, thank you very much. High bar, I suppose, in that case. Matt Warman, what do you make of the prospect, potentially, of Donald Trump running again?
Well, I think what I really regret in politics, both in the US and the UK, is that assumption that the most divisive campaign is the one that will win. And I think we've had too much of that in British politics, but you look at America and it really is supercharged there. And so I would hope that whoever runs, they would look at these results and think maybe the most divisive candidates are not the most electorally successful, and that could shape their platform.
Emma?
Well, we know that Trump hates losing, doesn't he? So depending on how these results pan out, he may or may not decide to run again for presidential election. I think if he doesn't run again, then that can only be good for Britain and for the rest of the world, because this man is entirely focused on what's good for him. Obviously, we'll have to work with whoever does win the presidential election, but I think it would be better for all of us if he didn't throw his hat in the ring.
What do you think of the prospect of Donald Trump running?
I think his economic policies were extremely good. His presentation left something to be desired. The United States is still the largest economy in the world by far, and it's very important for the UK and for economic prosperity that we have a really competent US president in charge. We haven't got one at the moment.
Right, and would you say that another President Trump, would that actually be competent in that sense? Is that what you're saying?
Well, if he was to actually follow the policies he was following before on the economy, he did a good job.
What do you think?
I think we all know the toxicity that Donald Trump would bring to the race if he does try and become the president again. We've had a taste of it in the last couple of weeks with Ron DeSantis. Last week he was, before Donald Trump loves his nicknames, calling him Ron DeSanctimonious. He's been saying that Ron DeSantis shouldn't put his hat in the ring. If he does, there's some very damaging information that only perhaps his wife knows that Donald Trump is going to be putting into the public domain. We know that he likes to fight messy. We know what happened last time after he lost, and then we had the insurrection in the US Capitol. I don't think it's good for anyone if he decides to run. And I think if he had any self-awareness after seeing these results where his backed candidates didn't do so well, he wouldn't run. But as we know, he doesn't really tend to have much self-awareness, so I think it's probably quite likely he does choose to run.
Well, we'll wait for that big announcement. Let's return to politics here because, of course, on November the 17th, we have that big economic statement. This is the headline in the Daily Mail. All the papers are running with speculative reports of what might or might not be included in this statement. Now, Rishi Mulls' return of Brown's 50p top rate tax. That's Gordon Brown back in 2010. Of course, you will remember, those who've been following this story, that Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss wanted to cut the top rate of tax from 45p to 40. That was reversed, and now they may be looking at a return of the 50p rate. You were a backer of Trussonomics, as it was called.
Yes.
It was broadly poorly received. Certainly, it seemed by the markets, and much of it reversed that prospectus by Jeremy Hunt when he was appointed Chancellor. What do you think about a return of a higher top rate of tax?
Well, it's not a good signal for the UK in terms of people working hard and having enterprise. But, Trussonomics, or growthonomics, I'd prefer to call it, was really about supply-side changes. That was the really important area, rather than demand.
And you mean supply side, meaning reforms of things like planning or housing or childcare. And of course, they hadn't actually come through. But otherwise, you still thought the tax-cutting agenda, even though the market seemed to be spooked by unfunded tax cuts, was a good idea.
Well, the market wasn't spooked by it. That was, if we had a lot of time, I'd explain why that was an entirely parallel thing that was leapt on by those people who wanted power.
And who were they?
Well, Sunak and cohorts, of course.
Wow.
But the fact of the matter is they didn't handle it very well. But nobody in business asked for the 45p tax rate to be reduced. It was a surprise. What we did want was for corporation tax to be reduced. What we did want was for deregulation to happen, more planning reforms and so on, which would have boosted the economy. We're in a situation now where what we're facing is austerity, which is totally unnecessary.
Matt?
There's a lot of that I disagree with.
What do you disagree with?
Where to start? So look, I think it's obvious that whether it was down to comms or whether it was down to the policy, then the mini budget had consequences that we are going to have to spend some time picking the pieces up to put things back together again. That is going to make Jeremy Hunt's life immensely difficult. But what I do agree with is some of those supply side reforms, whatever you want to call them, are still incredibly necessary. necessary. Childcare in particular, something where we know that we need to do better planning. There's a lot of work to do. So I think a lot of those things do need to be done, and that's why the budget coming up needs to be about the package rather than focusing on any one.
But you have just admitted pretty well, haven't you, Matt Warman, that actually Jeremy Hunt's job is going to be, very difficult because of a previous Conservative Prime Minister. We're all going to pay higher taxes, rightly or wrongly, and we're all going to experience spending cuts.
Well, I think in part it's right to acknowledge that the quasi-Kwarteng budget has contributed to the problem, but I think it's also only fair to say, look, you've got to consider what's going on in Ukraine, you've got to consider COVID, all that. There are a range of factors that he has got to address, and denying that is just to deny reality.
But no one was talking about savings or spending cuts on this scale until that mini-budget came along. Liz Truss tried to mortgage the entire country on the back of tax cuts for the rich.
You did actually. Labour did sign up to quite a lot of that tax-cutting agenda, the cut in the basic rate from 20 pence to 19 pence. You were also in favour of reversing the national insurance hikes. I know you never supported it, but you backed that too, and, of course, the energy intervention. So it was only the 45 pence, wasn't it, really?
Well, some bits of that budget were still unravelling as the government unravelled yet again for about the 100th time in the last few years. And ultimately, we were pushing for a windfall tax on energy producers. There's other things that can be done, but this government won't do those things because they don't want to, because it's about values and it's about where you want the burden to fall. And they always want it to fall on working people and ordinary families.
John?
I can't agree with that. I mean, the business. The thing is, I mean, it's like a plague on both your houses, quite frankly. I mean, I oscillate between despair and rage on behalf of the business community, because we have a situation where people who are actually trying to create enterprise, generate the wealth to pay for public services, are just being knocked back completely by this budget. But Labour have no answer to it either. I mean, Labour's slightly better on tax at the moment, amazingly, because they want a 1p reduction in the general rate of taxation and they want to deal with business rates. That's remarkable in itself. But actually, we've got a socialist government now.
Oh,
and
Rishi Sunak's a socialist government, Matt.
And we have a choice.
I think we both disagree, but for different reasons.
And we have a choice.
Well, when you say it's a socialist government, just describe for our viewers what you mean. Why is Rishi Sunak a socialist heading a socialist government?
Because what he's doing is he's hammering business. He's withdrawing from deregulation. He's actually taxing enterprise. He's taxing individuals and taxing work. These are all the sorts of things that you'd normally expect from a Labour government.
I think it's quite hard to buy that. There's an obvious need to balance the books. There's an obvious need to redress some of the costs that we've got to pay. That's not the same thing as looking at what Labour have got, which the only thing we can say with certainty is that it's certainly unfunded. So I think we've got to be honest about.
We've set out how we would pay for the policies we've announced so far. We've set out how we would pay for them. We've said we'd be fiscally responsible. I don't see how
it's very easy. It's very easy to say you're going to be fiscally responsible. Demonstrating it is a different thing.
Well, we demonstrated when we were last in government.
Demonstrating
we grew the economy and kept taxes low. That's something that the past 12 years of Tory governments have failed to do. Spectacularly failed to do.
We can maybe discuss the history another time. But what I do think is true is demonstrating fiscal responsibility is what Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak are doing right now through that package that does seek to do some of the deregulatory stuff that we've talked about before, but also does seek to put some of those taxes back in.
Well, just briefly, would you back raising the higher rate of income tax to 50p?
Well, my gut instinct is no, but what I would say is that it all comes down to what that package is in the round.
All right, well, your gut says no. What does your gut say about a higher rate of tax to 50 pence, as was under Gordon Brown?
I'd say is yes. It's nice to see the Tories borrowing our policies again.
Ah, well, there you go. On which one is more socialist, do you think, John, in terms of Labour's policies or Rishi Sunak?
I think let's see what actually ends up in the budget. We obviously know that these policies are often floated and sometimes don't end up in there. But you look at the two tax rises that have been floated today. One is that one on the higher rate of income tax. One is on council tax, suggesting that they'd get rid of the cap, which means that bills can only go up by a certain amount a year without a local referendum. both of those things were things that were promised in the Tory manifesto that they wouldn't do. And Rishi Sunak's whole argument when he came in as Prime Minister for why there shouldn't be a general election was because he was following the mandate of the 2019 manifesto. And I think if you just see him slashing through the promises in that manifesto and doing whatever he feels he wants to, you're just going to see louder and louder calls for a general election.
John?
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. There will be louder calls for a general election. The idea that there's actually a fiscal black hole is a construct. The fact of the matter is...
Well, when you say it's a construct, I mean, listening to, either whether it's politicians on either side, they do agree there is a black hole in the finances that has been made worse to some extent. This is according to them, made worse. These are the people that are going to have to come up with the budget, and Labour is no doubt going to scrutinise it as a result of the Kwasi and Liz Truss measures. Now, we will see how big that so-called black hole is, as you call it, on the 17th of November. But to say it's a construct...
No, it is a construct, because the fact of the matter is, had we had growth in the economy, there would have been no need to fill a black hole, because it would have been self-filling.
But there hasn't been growth.
They have created a black hole. They have created a black hole because it was politically convenient to do so. And if you've actually got this so-called black hole, bearing in mind that we have the second lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. The United States and others have much higher debt ratios.
Are you really saying that the OBR, when they come forward with their forecast next week, are just going to be coming up with these figures just willy-nilly based on their own political prejudices?
No, what I'm saying is that the OBR will identify that there is a shortfall for public spending. If you're going to balance the books within... No, hold on. If you're going to balance the books within 1 year. But if you're looking at the longer term, actually, the debt could have been paid down perfectly well without having to take these measures.
Emma? Did you want to respond? I mean,
I think I've said what I need.
I mean, it's interesting that the black hole is politically convenient for anybody. That doesn't feel like the reality we're living in.
And I think most people have thought that actually that was the reason the markets spooked, because they didn't trust that it would be paid back. But
there are plenty of economists who also disagree with it.
Yeah, all right, that's true. Economists and experts, they've been out of fashion for a while. Let's have a look at this video. Now, for those of you who can't remember, that was Rishi Sunak's campaign video as part of his leadership bid. It was about shredding or getting rid of some or all of EU laws. But this is today's headline in the Financial Times. UK plan to scrap all EU laws, suffers new setback. So, looks like the bonfire isn't going to happen, John. Is that disappointing?
If it doesn't happen, it will be hugely disappointing for the 85% of businesses in the UK who are family-owned or run, because it's those businesses that are the backbone of the economy that actually generate enterprise and innovation, and it's those businesses that are drowning in red tape. Big businesses quite like it, of course, because it's a barrier to entry, and it's actually a means of competing.
Will you be disappointed if it doesn't happen?
Look, I was one of the few Labour MPs who voted for the Brexit deal because I believed we should get through the gridlock and make progress. But what this bill is going to do is going to have ministers deciding what should be converted, what should be retained, what should be got rid of. And that is not democratic. That is far from taking back any control whatsoever. That's people in back rooms making decisions about people's employment rights, environmental standards, food standards, animal rights. I think these should have proper consideration on the floor of the House of Commons, with MPs, with trade unions, with industry, with everybody involved. It shouldn't be just a mass deregulation behind closed doors. That's very dangerous and very reckless. And considering that a couple more thousand of them have been found now as well, just this week, I think 1,400 more that the government didn't even know existed, I definitely don't trust them behind closed doors to do any of this.
John?
I think the 1,400 was actually a set of moribund regulations that have simply been dragged up, as another weapon.
You know
to
the
actually
detail of
stop it
every
happening.
single one of them? Because they will impact on people's lives.
Well, I have a very good idea of what the sort of regulations all these things are. And there is a thing called the Regulatory Policy Committee, I happen to know because I sit on it, that actually does the cost-benefit analysis of every single legislative proposal that goes through Parliament.
Right,
so
but what
there is scrutiny.
Yeah, but what people will want to know is what regulations are you talking about? Give us some specific examples of these dreadful regulations, this red tape that you want to get rid of.
Well, there's all sorts of bureaucratic stuff. For example, the Ergonomics Directive, which required businesses to do a checklist exercise each year of the ergonomics in a office environment. You know, the problem with regulation is that they're all little things that cumulatively add up.
Right, you could get rid of that, couldn't you?
That causes huge...
Well, this is the thing. We're talking about thousands of pieces of legislation here. It needs to be considered properly, openly, on the floor of the House of Commons.
So if you were going down a list, would you get rid of the Natalie called ergonomics, whatever it is, regulation for people's office space? Would you get rid of that?
I mean, I don't know enough about that, to be perfectly honest. It's a bit obscure, but what I do know about is some of these laws relate to holiday leave, maternity leave, people's rights at work. They're important. They should not be left to the Tories to decide behind closed doors.
But we had all of those things before we joined the EU. And I mean, are we actually saying...
Not what they are now. They weren't before we joined the EU.
Are we actually saying... But we would have had the sort of legislation for those sorts of areas.
Could have. I'm talking about reality.
There's obviously a bureaucratic burden of having to follow different laws for businesses. There's also a bureaucratic burden on the other side. If you suddenly start junking stuff en masse, and there's laws there that don't really make much of a difference to how our country's run and whether business is successful or not, if loads of small firms are suddenly having all these rules changed and have to get used to them, that is a bureaucratic burden on businesses.
But you see, that's always the excuse for not actually removing the burden on business. The fact of the matter is that there's so much legislation that most business owners don't even know what half of it is and can't comply with it anyway.
But is it responsible to
end up being in trouble?
But is it responsible, though, to get rid of the whole lot in one go without knowing?
That's not what they're doing.
Right.
I mean, what they're doing is they're going to transpose it into UK law and review it. It is not junking vast amounts of legislation.
Ministers decide what will be scrapped, not Parliament. Ministers decide what's going to be scrapped. That's not democratic.
Parliament will scrutinise it in the end because it will go to the committee.
What I find odd is the complaint that UK elected and appointed ministers are somehow less able to do this than their European counterparts. This is about this is a fundamental tenet of that Brexit conversation. It's about the UK having the nimbleness and the agility to make its own decisions and doing it in the right way. And the idea that, for instance, we might make changes to maternity laws without them coming under the scrutiny of the House of Parliament is plainly absurd. Of course, that stuff will get the scrutiny that it requires. And the assumption that the UK government would want to make those rights less than they are now simply isn't borne out by the evidence of a Conservative government.
You've also got to take into account how these laws were made in the first place. I mean, I was a member of the European Parliament. I sat there and saw it happening. You go into the Parliament, the technocrats would present 150 pieces of legislation in about 2 hours, and all that would happen is the parties would rubber stamp them. They press the button or put their hands up.
Rehashing the old debates around Brexit again. We need to move forward.
But
we need to look
scrutiny.
sensibly at the changes that are going to be made to this legislation. Instead of going back to the old debate, let's look at what's happening in the future.
It's very important to understand there was no democratic scrutiny of the introduction of these things in the first place. It was a technocratic decision, and a lot of European regulation is actually made by committees.
As an MEP?
But the MEPs were written out of the script. That's the point I'm making.
I mean, Emma does make a reasonable point, right, which is that lots of these changes are going to be things that the government will want to do in the interests of promoting workers' rights or business or whatever. And those are, and scrutinising those is the right thing to do. What we shouldn't do, though, is pretend that we have ever lived in a country where every single one of the most minor resolutions was not made through delegated powers. They always have been. The scaremongering around some of this is unnecessary unnecessary, and it is an attempt to rehash the European debate.
But the bill gives ministers power to do this behind closed doors. That's the reality of it. You can sit there and say they're not going to do that, but the bill gives them the powers to do that.
All right, we're going to move on because we're going to talk, as we said in the headlines, about the online abuse, sadly, that MPs suffer. A new BBC investigation has been carried out into the abuse. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. What has the investigation found, Alex?
Will know, and I suspect most of the panel will know, that this phenomenon of abuse that MPs get online is no new thing. But this is a piece of work that's been done by the BBC's Shared Data Unit. And what they did was they looked at 3 million tweets which were aimed at MPs during a 6-week period in the spring. They then used an online tool which was developed by a research unit that's funded by Google to analyse those tweets and rate them on a level of toxicity. So using things like the words that appear, offensive language, how likely they might be to make someone want to leave a conversation. And what it found was around 1 in 20 were deemed to be toxic. Women were marginally more likely to be subject to this kind of abuse than men. Women were more likely to be subject to sexualised language, more likely to be called ignorant or thick. Men were more likely to be called liars. And of course, what all this does, Joe, is raise the questions which have been debated before, but remain no less relevant, about what this does to political discourse, what this does to the state of our democracy. Because you speak to some MPs and they say, when you're getting this level of abuse, which goes beyond the normal rough and tumble or scrutiny that people expect within political debate, what it can do is put them off wanting to weigh in on controversial subjects, sometimes the topics that actually deserve the best level of debate, and potentially, as we've heard before, put some people off getting into politics altogether. So there's a serious conversation about the ramifications of the kind of abuse that this study shows is still very prevalent.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's only when you see the sort of scale and the numbers that it really brings it home when you think on a daily basis. I mean, what might be the sort of consequences or outcomes of this investigation in terms of going ahead with policy?
We're talking to a couple of MPs on and off the record, and some people say to me that if they know they're going to get a huge amount of backlash, they'll be reluctant to state their position on a certain issue. They might even reconsider their position on a certain issue. Jess Phillips said that she knows of people who have been in that position, and while she's been very vocal on Twitter and says she wants to continue to be, it does make her think a little bit about it. The MP Flick Drummond, Conservative MP, she's come off Twitter altogether, but says again it makes her think twice before she weighs in or voices an opinion on certain subjects. And more broadly, we spoke to the political think tank Demos, and they say there is a concern that it's putting people off standing. It's a concern that it's putting people off or changing the way that people think about policy. And the other point to bear in mind that often that this is a vocal minority on Twitter. So this is 1 in 20 of the tweets that we examined over this period is deemed to be toxic. That obviously means 19 out of 20 aren't. But sometimes that vocal minority is having a disproportionate effect on public debate because of the impact it's having on MPs who are receiving this kind of thing.
Alex Forsyth, thank you very much. Emma, unfortunately, you appear relatively high up on the list in terms of the amount of abuse you receive. What sort of thing are we talking about here without being too graphic?
Well, I'm a working class woman with an accent for one, so I get a lot of that thrown at us. I get a lot about my appearance. But I think for me, it can be really terrifying. So from my previous job, I've had people contact me on private message on Facebook. So I've been sat alone at night thinking, oh, I'll check through my messages. And there's been people there threatening to shoot me, and there's been a big thread about how they could go about that. And these are people who I know can actually carry that out. Now, that's absolutely terrifying. There needs to be some controls put in place. The online harms bill has been delayed now since 2018. We need some action on this. And none of my friends or family actually follow me online because they can't bear to see some of the abuse that I get. They find that so upsetting.
No, I'm sure.
I withdraw from it. It would never stop me from having my views or saying what I think. No, nothing ever would. But I ignore a lot of it. I put out what I put out and then I ignore and I don't get involved in the debate. And like I said, my friends and family and people close to me have all blocked us because, one, it protects them from these people, but also it stops them from seeing things that'll upset them about me.
Matt, what about your experiences?
Yeah, I think it is regrettably factually true that it is women who bear the brunt of it far more than men. But nonetheless, I've had incidents where I said I was going to be doing a surgery and a constituent advised me to bring a stab vest. It's sort of those sorts of threats are just routine. And the irony is that the police also know that they are routine. They know that a tiny fraction of them are made by people who could carry them out. And that makes their job infinitely harder because sorting the wheat from the chaff is almost impossible.
Ever thought of quitting Twitter?
No, but I have questioned what the point is. I think if I hadn't been on it in the first place, I'm not sure I'd join it.
I won't quit it because I think it's important for some of my constituents to get the message out there. But the minute I'm no longer doing this job, I would shut down all my social media accounts straight away.
What's your response, listening to what MPs experience on a daily basis in terms of the future of, yes, political discourse, but also putting people off perhaps going into politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's really horrible, of course. It's difficult to know. I mean, first of all, people should not be allowed to be anonymous on Twitter, in my view. So it should be that anybody who's making a comment, you actually know who they are, which will actually reduce the likelihood of them being horrific in the first place. But you know, I don't read the responses to what I put on Twitter. That's my policy. It's the best thing because then I don't know how nasty people are. But you know, I've had my home attacked. We've had offices that we use attacked over the months and years. It happens to a lot of people in public life. It's sort of grist to the mill, really, but it's not nice.
John?
I think the worrying thing when you look at the report, and it's awful what all of you have shared about your own personal experiences, is that a lot of MPs feel they can't take part in certain debates because of this. You look at the figures in the report when people have had spikes of abuse against them. There was the case of James Murray, who's a Labour frontbencher. He did an interview on the radio talking about trans rights, and then he got hundreds of toxic replies to that. There's another example, Deanna Davison, a Tory MP. She had written an open letter to Will Smith after he punched that guy at the Oscars?
Yes.
I forget. And then she got loads of abuse messages after that. Both those people were just doing their jobs. James Murray is a Labour politician. He's meant to go out on shows like this, give his opinion on different topics. It is for MPs to write open letters, get involved in debates like this. And if they feel they aren't able to do that, that's really worrying. And we want the best people to be MPs. We don't just want those people with super thick skin who'd be able to tolerate this.
Well, let me just show you this headline in the Times, because I suppose the question, Matt, you were formerly a tech journalist, is whether Elon Musk, the new owner of Twitter, will clean things up. The headline actually says Elon Musk's team asking some sacked Twitter staff to return. Obviously, he is now in control of the social media platform. He promptly sacked 4,000 staff, nearly 4,000 staff, and has now asked very quickly for some of them to come back. Do you think he'll clean it up, or it'll be more Wild West?
Well, I think what he's talked about before would indicate that it will be less regulated and more, he would say, free. I think I'd probably agree with your more Wild West term. But actually what this underlines is this isn't just a debate about politicians. This is a debate about the broader toxicity of social media. You don't have to be in public life to have a really terrible experience. And that's why I think it's right to say to people like Elon Musk, they might run big organisations, but they don't do so without regulation from both Europe, the US and the UK.
Just like to welcome viewers from BBC News Channel while we talk about Elon Musk taking over Twitter and whether it will clean things up or it'll be more Wild West. What do you think, Emma?
I think it'll probably be more Wild West, just looking at the way this guy behaves. I'm not very confident that he's going to tighten things up at all. And just picking up on the point made there, I think, you know, we're talking about MPs getting abuse, but we have lots of places we can go for help and support. You know, some young girls sitting at home getting abused on Twitter, or children, you know, being subjected to images they shouldn't be. They have nowhere to go for that help. So it is up to governments and it's up to these tech giants to put safeguards in place.
Well, you've talked about the safeguards. Let's just see this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Tech giants will be punished for legal but harmful content. Now, this has been a controversial clause. There are contradictory reports, Matt, about whether it will be included, this clause, to go after tech giants, that they will be punished for legal but harmful content, or it's going to be dropped. What's your intelligence on it?
Well, I think that the consensus of the reports, and I know no more than what we've all seen, is that the bill is likely to focus more tightly on protecting children rather than protecting what will primarily be adults from legal but harmful content. But I do think what's really important is what the public, I think, want to see is something that tackles a business model that has too often been allowed to promote websites that are pro-suicide, pro-eating disorders, those sorts of things. That kind of toxicity is something that I think is absolutely right for government to tackle, but you don't have to do it through a legal but harmful mechanism. You can find other ways of skinning the same cat.
Well, will you be disappointed if it's not there?
I mean, I think it does need to be there, but how it's done is it's quite complex, isn't it? Because sometimes what's harmful for one person, it's subjective, isn't it? Someone could see something as harassment and someone else could see it as just a comment. So this is really tricky and it's quite a grey area. So I can see why, to some degree, why the government keeps shelving this bill, because it is complex.
I mean, is it complex? I mean, it was something that was certainly called for by many wings of the sort of political spectrum, and now does seem to be difficult. Certainly there was pushback from people on freedom of speech reasons and grounds.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has complicated its passage is obviously we've seen different Tory administrations. So we had Boris Johnson then in the Tory leadership race in the summer, Liz Truss raised concerns, particularly about this stuff on legal but harmful. And then they were talking about how she was going to change it. And then obviously in the last couple of weeks, we've had Rishi Sunak come in again. And I think that is, it is a tricky issue. That's why it has taken a while. But obviously the different changing prime ministers made that even harder.
Should it be there or not?
I tend towards freedom of speech. I think that if people make any comment anywhere, they should be identifiable so that they have to take accountability for what they say. That will actually stop quite a bit. Also, Musk is talking about charging, isn't he, for Twitter? So that will make a difference to who goes on Twitter and what they actually do.
Let's have a look inside the chamber of the House of Commons. We have 5 minutes until Prime Minister's questions. We say this now every week. It's the third time Rishi Sunak will be facing Keir Starmer. It has been a busy few weeks for him. But one MP who isn't going to be there today in the chamber is the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. He's going to be somewhere quite different, or not, as he seems to imply in this TikTok video.
I don't think I've got any fears or phobias, but I'm about to find out. I'm Matt Hancock, I'm the MP for West Suffolk, and I'm best known for being the former Health Secretary. There are people who will criticise a sitting MP going to the jungle, but showing that we politicians are normal human beings is actually really important. Survival in the jungle is a good metaphor for the world I work in.
Oh, that was lovely, that reaction, Matt. What did you think?
I think it's hard to argue that you best serve your constituents from the jungle in Australia.
Try. No, don't.
But I suppose what I would say is there is a kernel of truth in the idea that politicians should get out there and communicate in every possible way.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't be doing it like this.
No. Emma, what did you think? Did you like the video?
It's the first time I've seen it, and I'm feeling a bit. I don't know how to put it into words, to be honest. But I think, you don't need to go on a reality television to connect with your constituents. I connect with my constituents every single week. I live in amongst them. Do you know, I go out, I knock on doors, I talk to people. I don't need to go on a reality television show to show them that I'm a real person. They see that every single day of the week. If he has to go on a reality show to prove that, there's something seriously amiss.
You were shaking your head in hands a little bit when the video was going on. Why is that?
It's a bit creepy, isn't it? I mean, I'm sort of rather pleased to see Matt Hancock locked down while the rest of us are free to do what we like.
A little bit of revenge there, is there, from you, John Lockwell? I mean, what do you make of him saying, a lot of people will criticise it, but I'm going to try and do some good while I'm there, show politicians in a normal light and talk about the issues that he is supporting and campaigning for, like
Well, it'd be
dyslexia.
interesting to see what happens. I mean, technically speaking, as I understand it, MPs can actually do whatever they like. They're not obliged to even sit in Parliament, but the electorate might have a say.
John?
I think Matt Hancock's going to be slightly disappointed if he thinks that the only thing holding him back from mass popularity with the public is that people haven't seen enough Matt Hancock. And if you just get more and more Matt Hancock, people will just fall in love with him and think he's amazing. And I'm not sure he is the perfect candidate to show that politicians are normal human beings. I think maybe there are other people who might be better to illustrate that. And his claim that he's going to be able to kind of raise awareness about his private members bill that he's coming up in the Commons in the next few weeks by going on this programme, I think he's going to be really disappointed by that, because I've not seen loads of I'm a Celebrity before, but I don't think there's going to be lots of chat about private members bills.
I doubt it very much, but are you all going to be watching?
I've never been a big fan before. I'm not sure this is the thing that will tip me over the edge.
Come on.
You will be watching, won't you?
I might tune in from time to time, but it's not a priority for us.
All right, well, we've got a couple of minutes to go until Prime Minister's questions. What do you think Keir Starmer will go on today?
I would put a lot of money on him going on the problems that Rishi Sunak has faced since he became Prime Minister. I was speaking to a Tory MP yesterday, one of Matt's colleagues, said it's a bit like an advent calendar of sleaze. Every day of Rishi Sunak's Prime Ministership so far, we've had a different problem with a different minister, mostly Gavin Williamson and Suella Braverman. I think you are going to see Keir Starmer ramping up the pressure to get rid of Suella Braverman now he's got rid of Gavin Williamson.
Matt, what did you say, an advent calendar of sleaze?
Well, I don't think that's quite right. I think John's absolutely right. That of course, it's what Keir Starmer is likely to have a go at. The reality is, what matters to people up and down the country are the issues, not the personalities. And I think that's what we should be talking about, and that's what I'm sure Rishi will highlight. And that seems to me to be the right thing to do. We've got serious issues to tackle, and we need serious responses to them.
But the serious issues need tackling by someone who's got integrity and who's open and honest with the British public. And I think Keir Starmer will go on the PM's judgment today around the Home Secretary and around Gavin.
Do you think he has been tarnished already and damaged to some extent in terms of credibility by Gavin Williamson and the ongoing rows over Suella Braverman?
So no is the honest answer. When people are emailing me, the top issues remain the issues rather than the personalities, and I think that will continue to be the case for a long time.
It is true that Westminster is obviously always interested in these issues of personalities and what is going on. Do you think the public are really taking account of what's going on, or are they concentrating on what Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will do in a week's time?
I think it's entertainment, but it's actually irrelevant for people in the regions who have a cost of living crisis, fuel poverty, and are trying to run businesses. I mean, what Keir Starmer should ask Sunak is why he's buying expensive gas from fracked gas from the United States when we have endless supplies of cheap fracked gas under our feet.
Let's go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, with Armistice Day on Friday, I know that colleagues from across the House will want to join me in remembering those who have lost their lives in the service of our country. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people I serve will, of course, be commemorating remembrance. Bermondsey was the original home of the poppy factory, providing work for injured veterans of the Great War over 100 years ago. But, Mr. Speaker, COVID restrictions were a necessary, if painful, experience. Across the country, most people made enormous sacrifices, like Charlotte, my constituents, and local councillor Lorraine, unable to see their mums in their final days. These people were betrayed by the Conservatives who parted their way through lockdown, You may not like it, but you can all go to eat kangaroo testicles for all I care. But those Conservatives covered Downing Street in suitcases of wine, in vomit and in fixed penalty notices. Can this Prime Minister promise today he will use his power of veto to ensure that no one who received an FPN for breaking COVID laws is rewarded with a seat in the House of Lords?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I can say is that this government during COVID ensured that we protected people's jobs, that we supported the NHS to get through the difficult times, and that we rolled out the fastest vaccine in Europe. That's what we did for this country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the commitments made by my right honourable friend at COP27 this week. If he wants to do something that really helps get us to net zero, improves our energy security and helps create new opportunities in places like Milford Haven, South Wales, South West England, can I urge him to really throw the full weight of his office behind delivering floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea and crucially ensure that decisions being taken now by the Crown Estate and the Treasury mean that the economic value, the jobs of this new industry stay here in the UK?
Well, can I praise my right honourable friend for highlighting the incredible potential of floating offshore wind technology to help us move to net zero. He's right about the opportunities in the Celtic Sea and for Wales more generally, and I can confirm to him that Crown Estate's leasing process is expected to deliver more seabed leases for many more projects.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about Remembrance Day? We remember all those who paid the ultimate price and all those who have served and are serving our country. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the member for South Staffordshire told a civil servant to slit their throat. How does the Prime Minister think the victim of that bullying felt when he expressed great sadness at his resignation?
Mr. Speaker, unequivocally, the behaviour complained of was unacceptable, and it is absolutely right. It is absolutely right that the right honourable gentleman has resigned. For the record, I did not know about any of the specific concerns relating to his conduct as Secretary of State or Chief Whip, which date back some years. I believe that people in public life should treat others with consideration and respect, and those are the principles that this government will stand by.
Mr. Speaker, the member for South Staffordshire spent years courting the idea he can intimidate others, blurring the lines to normalise bullying behaviour. It's precisely why the Prime Minister gave him a job. The truth is simple. He's a pathetic bully. But he would never get away with it if people like the Prime Minister didn't hand him power. So does he regret his decision to make him a government minister?
Mr. Speaker, I obviously regret appointing someone who has had to resign in these circumstances. But I think what the British people would like to know is that when situations like this arise, that they will be dealt with properly. And that's why it is absolutely right that he resigned, and it's why it is absolutely right that there is an investigation to look into these matters properly. I said my government would be characterised by integrity, professionalism and accountability, and it will.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, everyone in the country knows someone like the member for South Staffordshire. A sad middle manager getting off on intimidating those beneath him. But everyone in the country also knows someone like the Prime Minister. The boss who is so weak, so worried the bullies will turn on him, that he hides behind them. What message does he think it sends when, rather than take on the bullies, he lines up alongside them and thanks them for their loyalty?
Mr. Speaker, the message that I clearly want to send is that integrity in public life matters. And that is why it is right that the right honourable member has resigned. It is why it is right that there is a rigorous process to examine these issues. But as well as focusing on this one individual, it is also right and important that we keep delivering for the whole country. And that's why this government will continue to concentrate on stabilising the economy, on strengthening the NHS and on tackling illegal migration. Those are my priorities. Those are the priorities of the British people, and this government will deliver on them.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is he can't stand up to a run-of-the-mill bully. So he has no chance of standing up to vested interests on behalf of working people. Take Shell. They made record profits this year, £26 billion. How much have they paid under his so-called windfall tax?
Mr. Speaker, I was Chancellor who introduced an extra tax on the oil and gas companies. Right, but he talks, Mr. Speaker, he talks about working people. The right honourable member voted against legislation to stop strikes disrupting working people. He voted against legislation to stop extremist protesters disrupting working people. That's because he's not on the side of working people, Mr. Speaker. That's what the Conservatives are for.
Mr. Speaker, I'm against all of those causing chaos, damage to our public services and to our economy, whether they are gluing themselves to the road or sitting on the government benches. Mr. Speaker, there was no answer to the question because the answer is nothing. Shell haven't paid a penny in windfall tax. Why? Because for every pound they spend digging for fossil fuels, he hands them a 90p tax break, and it's costing the taxpayer billions. So will he find a backbone and end his absurd oil and gas giveaway?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the party opposite will never understand is that it's businesses investing that create jobs in this country. Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House, we understand that. We will support businesses to invest, to create jobs, because that's how we create prosperity, that's how we support strong public services, and that's what you get with a Conservative government.
There's only one party that crashed the economy, and they're all sitting there. It's a pattern, Mr. Speaker, it's a pattern with this Prime Minister. Too weak to sack the security threat sat around the Cabinet table. Too weak to take part in a leadership contest after he lost the first one. Too weak to stand up for working people. He spent weeks flirting with the climate change deniers in his party, then scuttled off to COP at the last minute. In the budget next week, he'll be too weak to end his oil and gas giveaway, scrap the non-dom tax breaks, and end the farce of taxpayers subsidising private schools. That's what Labour would do, a proper plan for working people. Mr. Speaker, if he can't even stand up to a cartoon bully with a pet spider, if he's too scared to face the public in an election, what chance has he got of running the country?
Mr. Speaker.
We want to try and get through on time, and I know some members want to catch my eye. They're not doing a good job so far. Come on, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman talks about judgment about putting people around the Cabinet table. I would just gently remind him he thought the member for Islington North was the right person to look after our security. But, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, he said a lot today. He said a lot today, but it's clear that he isn't focused on the serious issues that are confronting our country. We're strengthening our economy. He's backing the strikers. We're supporting people with energy bills. He's supporting the protesters. And we're tackling illegal migration. He's opposing every measure. The British people want real leadership on the serious global challenges we face, and that's what they'll get from this government.
Mr. Speaker, 84 years ago today in Germany, hundreds of synagogues were destroyed, Torah scrolls were desecrated, thousands of Jewish businesses and shops were destroyed as well. 91 Jewish people were murdered, and later 30,000 Jewish men were sent to the concentration camps. So as we commemorate Kristallnacht, let us remember that it was started with anti-Jewish hatred, it became anti-Semitism, and it's still prevalent in society today. So will my right honourable friend condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, but congratulate the Holocaust survivors who give their testimony year after year, and in particular congratulate the Holocaust Educational Trust for the brilliant work they do in making sure we will never ever forget what happened in the Holocaust.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his powerful question and his continued work on this issue. I completely agree with him. Anti-Semitism has no place in our society, and we're taking a strong lead in tackling it in all forms. We became the first country to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and the government's independent advisor on anti-Semitism regularly provides advice to ministers on how best to tackle this issue. And can I join him, as I know the whole House will, in praising the work of those survivors who so bravely tell their stories so that we might never forget.
SNP leader Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister for Armistice Day? We remember those that paid the ultimate sacrifice, those that continue to serve. And we should also remember the nuclear test veterans who continue to seek justice for themselves. Mr. Speaker, last night the Prime Minister suffered the self-inflicted loss of his first Cabinet Minister. A couple of weeks into the job, it turns out this Prime Minister's judgment is every bit as bad as his predecessors. Speaking of which, we now know that his former friend, the former Prime Minister, plans to hand out seats in the House of Lords to at least 4 Tory MPs, including the current Secretary of State for Scotland. So here's another test of judgment for the new Prime Minister. Does he think it right to keep a man in a cabinet who's clearly far more interested in getting his hands on an ermine robe than playing by the rules of Scottish democracy?
Mr. Speaker, I'm obviously not going to comment on speculation around such lists. Any list would, of course, follow the normal procedures and processes that are in place.
Ian Blackford.
I'm afraid it's not speculation, and of course the Prime Minister clearly doesn't get how corrupt this all looks to people in Scotland. Because not only do we have a UK government that denies democracy, we now have a Secretary of State that is running scared from it. In the middle of a Tory cost of living crisis, the Scotland office is now to be led by a baron-in-waiting, biding his time until he can cash in on the 300-day job for life in the House of Lords. He should be sacked from the Cabinet, and the people of Dumfries and Galloway should be given the chance to sack the Tories in a by-election. The Prime Minister's judgment is already in tatters. If he has any integrity left, will he now put a stop to these 2 predecessors stuffing the House of Lords with his cronies?
Mr. Speaker, what the Secretary of State and I are jointly focused on is working constructively with the Scottish Government to deliver for the people of Scotland. I'll be pleased to be meeting the First Minister tomorrow, because that, I think, is what the people of Scotland want to see.
Ian Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Criminal gangs who are operating to bring people into this country in small boats, an issue that directly affects my constituents of Folkestone and Hythe, are openly using social media platforms to recruit people to use their services. Can my right honourable friend confirm that the Online Safety Bill will require social media platforms to take effective action to remove this content? And is it also the intention of the government to bring the bill back later this month?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his work in raising awareness of this particular issue. He is absolutely right, and I'm pleased to give him the reassurance that the Online Safety Bill will require platforms to remove and limit the spread of illegal content and activity online. Assisting illegal immigration is listed as a priority bill a priority offence in the bill, and we look forward to bringing it back to the House in due course.
Samuel Roberts.
The Prime Minister is struggling to rebuild the Tories' ruined economic credibility after his predecessor scorned the Office for Budget Responsibility. But in a Bloomberg interview just last week, his Trade Secretary disputed OBR forecasts that trade will be 15% lower because of Brexit. Britain's economic prospects are worsened by being outside the world's largest trading bloc. That is a fact. So who does he agree with? The OBR or his Tory minister?
Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the great opportunities of Brexit is our ability to trade more with countries around the world. And actually, I know the honourable lady will actually want to speak to many of the Welsh farmers who are enjoying selling their lamb to the new markets that we have opened up for them. That's what we'll get on and deliver.
Villiers.
Mr. Speaker, excessive housing targets are placing greater and greater pressure on councils to approve development which damages our environment. When the Prime Minister came to Finchley over the summer, he said he wanted to abolish those targets. Will he use the Levelling Up Bill report stage to bring forward government amendments to do that?
Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to making home ownership a reality for a new generation, and we must build homes in the right places where people want to live and work. But, as the Right Honourable Lady knows, and as I said, I want those decisions to be taken locally, with greater say for local communities rather than distant bureaucrats, and my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State, is happy to sit and meet with her to discuss how best to make this a reality.
British Chairman. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister remember back in February when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, when I informed him that due to his incompetence in that job, the children in my constituency would go to bed that night with no food in their tummy and no heat in their homes? What is he now going to do as Prime Minister to make sure that in every community in our country, children aren't in that situation in this hard winter ahead?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the absolute best way to ensure that children do not grow up in poverty, which is something that none of us want to see, is to ensure that they do not grow up in a workless household. And the record under these governments is that 700,000 fewer children are growing up in workless households, and that's because Conservative governments create jobs for people, Mr. Speaker, and that's the best anti-poverty strategy that we have.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday I visited a bridging hotel in my constituency that is currently housing 77 Afghan refugees, as local organisations search for permanent accommodation for them following the success of Operation Pitting. Many of the refugees I met held highly skilled jobs back in Afghanistan, including a doctor, international athletes and government ministers. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that our government will do more to support these highly skilled individuals to enter the UK workforce?
Well, it's nice to hear from my honourable friend again this week, and I can reassure him that we are completely committed to supporting Afghan refugees into the employment opportunities here in the UK. The Department for Work and Pensions has a full programme in place, and I can also tell him that our Refugee Leads Network brings together refugee organisations and DWP to connect those refugees with employment opportunities, and I look forward to seeing the fruits of that programme with him in the near future.
Bradshaw.
5 years ago, the government belatedly launched a review into the security risk posed by handing thousands of mainly wealthy Russian and Chinese nationals so-called golden visas so that they could live in Britain. It also promised to publish the results of that review. Why hasn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we did indeed review and indeed end the visa that the honourable gentleman is raising. The Home Office is currently conducting the right way to replace that visa with something that is more sustainable going forward and protects our security interests. I'll be happy to have the Home Secretary write to him with an update on that process.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. The UK has a workforce shortage, yet millions of parents are unable to work at full tilt, and childcare providers are going belly up due to policies being a maddeningly expensive muddle of a mess. Will my right honourable friend please confirm that after decades of ineffective tinkering and endless policies, that he will be the man to give us proper childcare reform?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say we've announced ambitious new plans to improve the cost, the choice and the availability of childcare to benefit hundreds of thousands of parents across the country. This includes measures to increase the number of children that we can look after by each staff member and indeed make it easier for people to become childminders. We'll respond to all of these proposals in very short order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister has been very busy failing to stand up to bullies, but in the real world, schools and colleges across the country looking after actual children are struggling to make ends meet. One London head teacher has scrapped plans for mental health counsellors. A head teacher in Twickenham is no longer filling teaching assistant vacancies, whilst another is axing school trips. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister give pupils and parents a cast-iron guarantee that in next week's autumn statement there will be no real terms cuts to school and college budgets?
Mr. Speaker, we've significantly increased funding going into schools over the next 2 years, but on top of that, it was important to this government to help those children who left behind their education opportunities during the pandemic, which is why we invested £5 billion to helping those children catch up, including unveiling the most comprehensive programme of tutoring that this country has ever seen. And is closing the attainment gap and disproportionately benefiting disadvantaged children, and is something that I know all colleagues will get behind.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite a productive meeting with the Immigration Minister yesterday, the Home Office continues to house over 400 asylum seekers in 2 neighbouring hotels in my constituency. It's clear from my meetings with GPs and Derbyshire Police that this huge influx of people in such a small area is putting local services under immense strain. Before services in Area Wash hit breaking point, will my right honourable friend commit to immediate reduction in asylum seekers concentrated in one place? And will he intervene to set a timetable for the permanent closure of accommodation centres at this location?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me give my honourable friend my absolute cast-iron commitment that we want to get to grips with this problem. The best way to resolve it is to stop criminal gangs profiting from an illegal trade in human lives and the unacceptable rise in channel crossings, which is putting unsustainable pressure on our system and local services. She has my reassurance that the Home Secretary and I are working day and night to resolve this problem, not just to end the use of expensive contingency accommodation, but for more fundamental reform so that we can finally get to grips with this issue, protect our borders and end illegal migration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, under the Prime Minister's short premiership, he's had 1 minister resign and 1 that urgently needs to be sacked. Can the Prime Minister clarify to the House and the rest of the country when the scheduled programme of integrity, professionalism and accountability will begin?
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely because I want a government characterised by integrity, professionalism and accountability that the right honourable gentleman was right to resign, and it's right that we have an independent process. That's the type of government I will lead. When situations like this arise, we will deal with them properly, and that's what we have done.
Ian Russell. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
How is it? It's quite amazing, isn't it, when a minister's come from his post to get more cheers. Come on, Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues. Just like the Prime Minister, I was very fortunate to join the Royal British Legion in becoming a Poppy volunteer recently. I joined colleagues in Abbots Langley, and I was part of Les Betters's team. And this week I'll be joining Tony Griffiths and his team in the Tudor Ward in Watford. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask if the Prime Minister will join me in thanking all of the Poppy Appeal volunteers across the country and in my constituency for their work to ensure that we always remember those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. And if the Prime Minister, or perhaps the Minister for Veterans, will also visit Watford to meet our heroic veterans who we owe so much. Thank you.
My honourable friend is a fantastic champion for Watford, and it is a pleasure to join him in thanking the Royal British Legion's Poppy Appeal volunteers, both in Watford and across the country. There is no greater sacrifice than those who lay down their lives in the service of our nation, so I'm proud, as many others are, to support the Poppy Appeal and to honour our veterans.
Carl Turner.
If the Prime Minister or any member of his many households became unwell, would he start ringing the GP surgery at 8 o'clock each morning to not get an appointment? Would he go off to accident and emergency and wait 12 hours to be seen? Would he call an ambulance which wouldn't come? Or would he use some of his £750 million unearned wealth to pay privately and see somebody there and then?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful, and let me put on record my thanks to the fantastic team at the Friarage Hospital in Northallerton who provided excellent care to my family over the years. But the honourable gentleman is right. to highlight the issue of people waiting unacceptably long for treatment that they need. That's why we've put record funding into the NHS to help with backlogs and waiting times this winter. It's why the Health Secretary and the Chancellor are discussing how best to deliver the reforms that we need, because I want to make sure that everyone gets the care they need, and we will continue to invest in more doctors, more nurses and more community scans so that we can deliver exactly that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Blackpool is due to benefit from a £300 million private sector-led regeneration project which will deliver thousands of new jobs for my constituents over the years ahead. To deliver this ambitious new project, we need support with a £40 million package of relocating the existing court complex which currently occupies the site. Various Secretaries of State have been very supportive of the project so far, so is the Prime Minister able to give me an update on when we can receive some good news about how we can get this project off the ground?
Well, can I join with the honourable member in recognising the importance of the Blackpool Central Regeneration Project to the town's levelling up ambitions. I can tell him that my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary and Housing Secretary, are in the process of resolving this issue for him and how best we can relocate the court complex. And I can tell him he won't have to wait very long for an update on the plans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a critical time for our steel industry, hit by massive energy costs and low demand, at a time when we need to support our industry to adapt to build the green technologies that we will need. Does the Prime Minister agree that our sovereign capability and our national security is dependent on a strong UK steel industry? And if so, will the government not sit on its hands? And what is the Prime Minister's plan for steel?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of our track record. Not only did we support one steel company in South Wales during coronavirus that needed our assistance, which we were pleased to do, we also have provided over £2 billion to support energy-intensive industries, including steel, with high energy bills, and, thanks to the work of my colleagues, removed the tariffs on exporting steel to the United States. But she has my assurance that we will continue to support steel because we recognise its importance to our economy and to our communities up and down the country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supermarkets such as Morrison's are abusing their dominant market position on fuel, charging up to 20p per litre more in Bridport than other towns in the region, thus preventing West Dorset residents from benefiting from the very unusual reduction in market price these days. Will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me to discuss what action can be taken against these commercial predators who harm our local residents in this way?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as Chancellor, I was pleased to cut duty by 5p a litre, the biggest ever cut in fuel duty to help motorists in our country. But I recognise the concerns the honourable gentleman raised. That's why we asked the Competition and Markets Authority to conduct an urgent review of the market. There are some actions to be considered coming out of that review, and I look forward to meeting with him and working with the CMA to explore its recommendations in more detail.
Liam Byrne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, across my constituency of Hodge Hill, I'll be delivering food bank collection crates because once more our food banks are running out of food. Does the Prime Minister understand the despair my constituents feel that he, as one of the richest men in Britain, is doing so little? They don't like the truth, Mr. Speaker. Does he understand the despair my constituents feel that he is doing so little for the poorest in Britain by refusing to cancel the £3 billion tax break for non-doms who profit from our country but won't make our country their home?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of my and this government's track record in supporting the most vulnerable in our society, and that will always continue. And it is a bit rich hearing from the gentleman the first person who reminded us what happens when the economy gets crashed by a Labour government. That's no way to help people. We will build a strong economy. That's what enables us to support the most vulnerable. That's what enables us to support strong public services.
Mr. Speaker, the British people are reliant on our party and this government to fulfil its promises on levelling up. Not just up and down the country, but sideways too. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Felixstowe and Harwich Freeport plan will be judged as an historic failure unless such a plan succeeds in levelling up a deprived ward that is in my constituency? And will my right honourable friend join me in Clacton to kick-start that plan? Also, Mr Speaker, will my right honourable friend commit to coming to the tendering showcase currently in the Jubilee Room until 2:30?
That sounds like a very appealing invitation, Mr Speaker, but I agree with my honourable friend that levelling up has to deliver for communities in every corner of the United Kingdom, including in coastal communities in the south, Mr Speaker. He knows I'm a champion of free ports, and I look forward to working with him to see how best we can realise their benefits in his area.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Those who wish to leave, please.
And that brings us to the end of this session of Prime Minister's Questions. Let me welcome our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, we have Pensions Minister Laura Trott. For Labour, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary Jonathan Ashworth. Welcome to you. And the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent Nick Eardley. Nick, first of all, unsurprisingly, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, focused very tightly, certainly the majority of his questions, on the resignation of Gavin Williamson amidst allegations of bullying and intimidation, including one official at the Ministry of Defence when Gavin Williamson was Defence Secretary, saying to him that he should slit his throat. He resigned. He's been sacked twice before, Gavin Williamson. What did it say, or what did it appear? How did it appear to you in terms of Rishi Sunak's responses?
Well, look, I think it was pretty uncomfortable for Rishi Sunak. The fact that Gavin Williamson resigned rather than was sacked, the fact that there wasn't any discussion about this between the pair until late yesterday evening, just before Gavin Williamson resigned. Labour are clearly not holding back on it. Some of the language Keir Starmer used there was...
Pathetic bully, he described Gavin
Williamson. Doesn't get much stronger in Parliament that you get away with, anyway. But I thought it was really interesting that Rishi Sunak's tone was quite different to the one we saw in the letter to Gavin Williamson last night. Last night, the Prime Minister was talking about his great sadness that Sir Gavin had quit. None of that in Parliament. It was all about that he'd done the right thing, that his language was unacceptable. And then there was this statement that he obviously regrets that he has appointed someone who had to resign. Not quite the same as regretting appointing him, given that there was a complaint that the Prime Minister knew about. So I think it was pretty uncomfortable for the PM there.
I mean, Laura, if he regrets Rishi Sunak appointing someone who has had to resign, why is he sad he's gone?
Well, I think there's always a sadness when a colleague has to resign, but I think the Prime Minister was very clear in the House today that the allegations are completely unacceptable. It's not behaviour that we would expect in any serving minister, and that he was right to resign. And I think it's now the case for the processes and the investigations that need to take place to go forward.
Jonathan?
I think the problem for Rishi Sunak is that everyone has known that Gavin Williamson has cultivated this almost cartoonish, menacing personality.
Because he was a former chief whip.
And he deliberately has acted. It's as if he's watched House of Cards and thought that's how you have to act as a chief whip. He's a bully. The dogs barking in the street knew what he was like. So the question is, why did Rishi Sunak appoint him in the first place? I think that shows a lack of judgment, and it shows how weak he is and how beholden he is to forces within his parliamentary party.
Laura?
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister knew about any specific allegations before. He knew there was a dispute. He didn't know any of the details of that.
He knew there was a complaint, though.
Yes, he did.
And should that have acted as a warning and a barrier to him being reappointed as a minister?
It's always very difficult in these situations because this is an investigation that is ongoing. He didn't know any of the details of this, and it's still ongoing now. You'll see in Gavin's resignation letter, he's saying he's going to fight the allegations. He's obviously also apologised. But I think the point about all of this is he's now resigned. We've got some very, very serious things that are facing this country at the moment, which we're going to come on and talk about later. That is what I think we should be focusing on rather than kind of personality.
Yeah, but was it a mistake to appoint him in the first place? I mean, do you agree with Jonathan? Did you know what Gavin Williamson was like? If it was common knowledge that this was how he behaved, did you know about these?
I've worked with Gavin and I've never had experienced anything like this. But these are very, very serious allegations. The most serious type of allegations, they absolutely need to be looked into, and he was right to resign.
If they are such serious allegations, and there was a complaint already that had been lodged against Gavin Williamson for his behaviour, how can Rishi Sunak, in all good conscience, when he wants a government, and he restated that pledge, a government that believes in integrity, professionalism and accountability, how could he write those words? It's with great sadness that I accept your resignation. You should have sacked him.
What I said right at the beginning, we're still human beings. politics. You know, this is a person with a family, you know, who has his own life. You know, we're not cartoon characters. And it is a matter of regret when a colleague has to go. But that does not mean that his behaviour in any way the alleged behaviour is in any way acceptable.
We have seen quite a lot of resignation letters and replies over the past few months, and I think anyone who's paid attention to them would know there are two different kinds of replies you can get. There is one that says, I'm sorry you've resigned, but I understand why, because you've done this, this and this needs cleared up. This was pretty short from the Prime Minister last night. It wasn't criticising Sir Gavin, and a lot of people will have read that and wondered, is the Prime Minister actually critical of what went on?
Well, I think he was very clear in the House today. I mean, I think, you know, when we get into...
Why didn't he say it in the letter?
Well, I think we're getting into criminology here in terms of these are the smoke signals from this and that and the other. He was extremely clear in the House today how he felt about this behaviour.
Jonathan?
I think it's pretty staggering, frankly, that Rishi Sunak didn't sack him when these absolutely outrageous text messages emerged on Sunday to the former Chief Whip. And I think it does in the end show that Rishi Sunak has got a monumental lack of judgment on this front, and he's pretty weak, because we all know why he wanted him there, because he knows he wanted this sort of bullying, menacing character to help keep his MPs in line. That's what it's all about in the end, and I think that tells you a lot about Rishi Sunak.
Anyone who has come into contact with the Prime Minister will know that that could not be further from the truth. You know, he is appointed in a cabinet with experience. He regrets the Gavin Williamson appointment, absolutely. But this is a cabinet and ministers who are focused on the issues that are facing the country at the moment. You know, we have a winter which is going to be very, very difficult. We've got to get people through a kind of severe cost of living crunch, and we've got to restore economic stability. That's what we're all focused on, and that's what he wants us to do.
And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But does this damage his credibility and judgment on other issues, big issues affecting the country, when, in fact, he has struggled in the first few weeks to just keep the ministers on board that he has appointed, without the opposition, particularly, calling for them to go?
I think that we've gone through this now, you know, several times. He regrets that this has happened. He said the behaviour is unacceptable, and we now want to move on and focus on the issues facing the country.
Well, let's do that. Let's have a look at this headline in the Times. Jonathan talked about smoke signals. You are both in pensions. You're the pensions minister, Laura. What do you say to this? Benefits and triple lock at risk in race to raise £55 billion. Now, the £55 billion is the supposed black hole in the public finances. The triple lock is the amount by which benefits and pensions would rise next year, either the highest of either growth earnings or inflation, which is at around 10%. Is it at risk?
I think we've got a very difficult global situation at the moment caused by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. There are going to be some very difficult decisions. The government is going to be guided by trying to protect the most vulnerable. I'm not going to comment on things that are coming out next week. We had an Opposition Day debate yesterday where I said this numerous times. But I think the important thing to emphasise is that we're putting a huge amount of support in place for people this winter, right now. So any uprating decision comes in from April. You know, we're putting a package of support in place for the most vulnerable to help them through a very difficult winter.
Right. I mean, it is obviously a critically important decision, though, isn't it?
Of course.
About how they are uprated next April. You won't say anything now, of course, in terms of will it happen. Why should it happen? I mean, why should benefits and pensions go up by inflation, by 10%?
I think if you're talking about the need to protect pensioners in general, without preempting, of course, any of the decisions that are coming next week, you know, pensioner poverty is a real thing. It's something that I and my job are extremely concerned about. We thankfully seen rates come down of absolute poverty since 2010, but pensioners are unable to increase their incomes in the same way that other people of working age are. And you know, making sure that they are properly protected is absolutely a priority for this government.
Is it a priority for you too, or why? Why should it be a priority, Jonathan, keeping the triple lock, which means uprating benefits and pensions if you do so with inflation? It's reported to cost £11 billion if you do that in 23-24. Why should you?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's just remember the reason why social security payments for working families, whether that's universal credit or for disabled people or for pensioners, is even being discussed and debated is because of the disastrous budget of 6 or 7 weeks ago that the Conservatives gave us. Now, what we've seen this year with the pension, because the uprating of the pension was based on last September's figures, it was ahead of this huge increase in inflation we've seen this year. that effectively amounted to something like a £480 cut in real terms in the level of the state pension this year. I think it would be deeply unfair, given the cost of living crisis that we are facing, given that pensioner poverty on the relative definition, different definition to what the government uses, on the relative definition has increased by 450,000 since 2010. I think it would be deeply unfair not to give pensioners that inflation-proofed uprating next year. And, by the way, this is a position which Rishi Sunak said would be the case only 6 months ago at the dispatch box. In fact, Liz Truss, when she was still Prime Minister, just a few weeks ago, said the Conservatives would honour this commitment.
But as you've said, it's worsened the economic situation to some extent because of the...
pay the price because of Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss's disastrous budget.
But you say it's unfair. You say it's unfair on pensioners, but there is a report out from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and the Nuffield Foundation, and they are saying that actually there are so many younger people struggling with the cost of living, high rent, struggling to get on the housing ladder. The report says a generation of Britons has ridden a wave of growing asset prices, pushing up the value of their houses and investments. Meanwhile, more than a decade of stagnant earnings has held back younger generations for whom earning their own economic success has become increasingly difficult. Do you accept that?
Well, I had a look at the report this morning, and within it, it says very clearly that pensioners are still more likely to be of low income. Now, wealth and assets is a different question. Obviously, they're more likely to be sitting in a house where they've paid off their mortgage than younger people. But they're still very cash poor, which is still the point of why the state pension is so important, and so many of them actually do rely on that alone.
Right. They could, of course, sell their homes, move somewhere smaller. Are these the sorts of policies that should be looked at? I mean, should some... I mean, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but you're looking at these reports and difficult decisions to be made, and you're looking at these decisions, the two of you. Should there be a case of means testing?
Well, let me make 2 points in response to that. First of all, pensioner poverty on the relative definition has gone up by 450,000 since 2010, and people feel that they have paid and worked all their life for their pension. My mum would say she's paid her stamps for that pension. The second thing is, I don't accept this argument that there's a sort of intergenerational unfairness, because today's workers are tomorrow's pensioners. And if we think the pension should wither down to a nugatory amount, what that means is that today's workers have to put more aside in their private and occupational pensions now. Now, when we've got a cost of living crisis, and the department's own figures show that I think it's 1 in 4 over 40s are not saving enough, people deserve to know that there will be the foundation of a good basic state pension in the future. So it's actually fair to today's workers. That's my argument, and that's what I strongly believe.
I mean, Laura, do you agree with that? Or should it be looked at in terms of a wealth tax for wealthy pensioners or those who are asset rich, for example? Should it always rise with inflation if it goes over a certain amount? You don't want to call it intergenerational unfairness or a battle between the two. Nobody would. But do you understand why reports like this are now coming out saying that younger people are really struggling and to some extent paying for older generations?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Jonathan has just said, actually, in terms of the importance of protecting people, and that this is, you know, as we go through, we need to make sure that people are saving enough for their private pensions as well as the state pension, and the state is always there, obviously, to make up any shortfall. That's why we've introduced automatic enrolment. It's been a huge success. I think in terms of when we're looking at the kind of broader picture, there's lots that we need to do to help younger people get onto the housing ladder, to accumulate wealth as they go through, save properly for their retirement. I mean, it's a huge policy issue, and one that I know the government's looking at, and a lot more needs to be done on.
There's going to be a lot of focus on this and many other issues on November the 17th. But what are your reflections on this sort of toing and froing over whether to uprate benefits and pensions in line with inflation, because it's the highest of the three metrics?
Well, look, there's a lot of rolling the pitch going on at the moment, where a lot of things are being put out there as potential worst-case scenarios, a lot of which I don't think will happen. I mean, my hunch is that the government will stick with the triple lock for the simple reason that it's in the manifesto, and Rishi Sunak's made a big thing of sticking with the manifesto. The question that I think is going to be really interesting next Thursday is what the government does do to fill the fiscal black hole. We think that it's going to be slightly more spending cuts than it's going to be tax increases. But the thing that's coming through a lot of conversations I'm having is that thresholds or stealth taxes are going to be a big part of what happens next Thursday, potentially in large parts of the tax system, where the point at which you start paying certain things is frozen for the next few years, and potentially the point at which you start paying the upper rate of income tax, if you're so lucky to earn £150,000 a year or so, that could be brought down a bit.
We're going to talk about something completely different. This story in the HuffPost, Yvette Cooper, Jonathan's colleague, the Shadow Home Secretary, slaps down Labour MP Stephen Kinnock over Labour ID card confusion. This is because the Shadow Immigration Minister Stephen Kinnock told Times Radio that ID cards could be one of the solutions to dealing with immigration, particularly people coming over in the small boats. He was, as the story says, then told that actually that is not the policy. Is Labour looking at this issue? Should they be looking at the issue of ID cards? Of course, it was something that was raised when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, but shelved.
Well, Yvette Cooper leads for the Labour Party on Home Affairs policy. As you know, she's the Shadow Home Secretary, so that suggests that Yvette Cooper has outlined the position. I do think it is, we should have a broader debate about this in society, because we know that ID cards have now been introduced. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. We know that when you're going to vote, you'll be asked to produce a form of ID, which is very curious because the Conservative Party historically always put themselves in a very strongly sort of libertarian position against ID cards, and they're now asking people to show ID when they're going to vote. And there is some suggestion on social media that the rules around younger people voting, they're more stringent, or they've got a more stringent set of criteria or rules about what would be accepted for young people to vote compared to older people. And I would not possibly make this allegation, but there are people suggesting that that's because younger people are more likely to vote Labour. I'm not making that allegation, but I do think the government need to clear this up, because when you look at it, it does seem a bit unfair as to why there's so many different rules for different ages in the voting.
Well, I mean, voter ID at when you go to vote is something that was in our 2019 manifesto. I know you're very keen on our 2019 manifesto, so we're fulfilling one of our pledges. It's actually the case that younger people are more likely to have ID. Then 99% of them have the relevant ID versus 98% of the general population. And there's lots of work going on with local authorities to ensure that they can provide this ID where people don't have it.
I mean, we can have a look at the list, because you both neatly moved on from ID cards to voter ID, but I will come back briefly on ID cards. This is a list of the forms of ID voters will need to bring with them to polling stations for the next local elections in May. Do you think it does skew against younger voters when you have a look at the list? You've got an older person's bus pass there, Oyster 60+ card, Freedom Pass 66+, but not a young person's rail card, for example.
Well, I mean, well, exactly. I mean, I was very excited to use my first vote when I was 18, and I voted for the Labour Party in the 1997.
Well done for putting that on the
general
record.
Election. I was very excited. But making the point that when I was 18, I don't think I'd have had any of those. I mean, I would have been. Is your national insurance card on there? I can't see the list. But
no,
I would not have had any of those as an 18-year-old when I first went to vote. So it does seem a bit unfair.
Well, I think the evidence is that the majority of them do, but where they don't, that we've got a process in place to make sure that they can still vote.
Right, but is it going to skew against younger voters? Because mostly these forms of ID will benefit and are held by people who are older.
The evidence says not.
This whole issue of ID cards, I mean, I remember it when it was brought forward by Tony Blair a long time ago, obviously pre-2010, in the 2000s. Is this an idea that's really being discussed, ID cards, in any shape, sense or form?
Don't think so, is the honest answer. I mean, I think that when you're looking at some of the issues in the south coast of England and how you deal with them, there are a lot of things thrown into the equation, but the idea that the Labour Party would go for ID cards as a big policy pitch doesn't seem likely to me at the moment.
What about the Conservatives? I mean, is this something that should be discussed, particularly with the difficulties the government is having to controlling immigration?
We've got no plans to introduce ID cards. We are doing a lot in terms of controlling immigration, particularly around the illegal immigration. Yes, I mean, we're turning around more boats than ever. We've got work with the French. We've got the Nationality and Borders Act, which introduces a lot of measures to, for example, give life sentences to people traffickers, to make sure that we're speeding up claims, measures which I should point out that the Labour Party voted against.
But why is it that only 4% of asylum claims have been processed last year?
Well, this is what some of these measures are going to try and help speed up. So, for example, there's a one-stop process, which means that asylum, any other protection matters will all be taken at the same time, which will stop, hopefully, some of the last-minute claims which kind of come through and extend the time it takes to process a claim.
I'm going to let you go, Nick. Nick Hurdley is going to leave now because we're going to go to Washington and talk to Julia Manchester, get the latest on the midterm elections. She is from the publication The Hill. Hello to you, Julia. What is the latest on the results for both the House of Representatives and the Senate in terms of races in the Congress?
Well, it's actually been kind of a surprising night, or last night, I should say, was a surprising night. We were expecting a red wave and that Republicans were expected to really sweep the House. Well, Republicans have gained seats, maybe, but it's still too close to call. So as of Wednesday morning, we don't know who's going to control the House or the Senate. In the House, we've seen that there have been some surprises where some incumbent Republicans like Lauren Boebert, for example, some Brits may know her as sort of a Marjorie Taylor Greene-like figure, very controversial, very Trumpian. She appears very in trouble in her deep, deep red district out in Colorado, whereas in the Senate, we have seen Democrats hold on to actually flip a seat in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman defeating Mehmet Oz. So we're waiting on results out of Arizona, Nevada, of course, Georgia, for example. So it's too close to call, but not the red wave Republicans were hoping for.
So a bit more optimism for Democrats. We talked a little bit earlier about how important these elections are in terms of Joe Biden's ability to govern and get things through Congress in the next 2 years, and the possibility of Donald Trump running again for the presidency. One of the things that might be of interest to people here is that there's been some Republican scepticism if they were to triumph in these races in terms of continued funding for the war in Ukraine. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, so for Lauren Boebert, for example, that very conservative, very pro-Trump congresswoman out in Colorado, she is an example of a Republican lawmaker who would push back against funding for the war in Ukraine. We saw a number of Republican candidates pushing back against that, saying, look, we have our own issues here in the United States. We don't want to, fund more money towards this. So if it were to be a Republican majority in the House, I would say it's relatively split on that issue. The party itself is very split on that issue. I think you have a lot of establishment Republicans who are very much pro funding Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. However, there's more of that America First wing of the party that is very skeptical of that, saying that we've given enough to Ukraine. It's time to, keep that money and divert it elsewhere. So the Republican Party very split over that. But, unfortunately, at the moment, we don't really know even how that issue will pan out because we're still waiting on so many House races.
Well, as you say, it could be a long few days or even a few weeks. Just briefly in terms of money and financial matters, the economy, I presume, was one of the major issues. What were the others for people voting in these midterms?
Yeah, so the economy was a major issue, but also abortion access. And there were many pundits and journalists, including myself, who were skeptical as to how much the issue of abortion access after the overturning of Roe v. Wade would really break through to voters. But a number of candidates, like John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, campaigned on that, as well as addressing the economy. So it seems that even though the economy was, like it always is, the chief issue, abortion access was also a high priority for voters, especially in these swing states.
Julia Manchester, thank you very much for joining us there from Washington. Impressions so far in terms of the midterm elections and what it might mean, because people always say how divisive the states is, and it looks as if that may continue.
Yes, I think the point that was just made around abortion was actually quite interesting. It's obviously a conscience issue over here in the UK, and we don't vote on party lines. But I think, for many women in the UK, the fact that abortion rights were being taken back in the US made rights feel very fragile. And that was extremely worrying. And I think it's a good thing to see that you can't just take away rights from women without some consequences.
Jonathan?
I totally, absolutely agree and endorse those remarks. It sort of looks like that Trump has been a drag on the Republican ticket, doesn't it?
Because he always thought he would be boosting some of his candidates.
Absolutely, and there's all this speculation that he's going to announce his run for presidency next week. I think he was anticipating a big boost for his wing of the Republican Party, which I think probably pretty much dominates the Republican Party now, but it looks like that style of politics in the US could be in trouble, perhaps.
I mean, what about the consensus here, of course, of continued financing of the war in Ukraine? Not for the war, obviously, but for Ukraine. I mean, how worried are you by what Julia said there about Republican reaction if they do, in fact, win in the House of Representatives and the Senate?
Well, of course, America is one of our closest allies. We work very closely with them on international security issues. And I think, you know, for us as a country, you know, across party, we would be making the case to America to continue that funding and that support.
But does it worry you? Because obviously that would be a big, big blow, wouldn't it, to the government's continued support?
Well, obviously the presidency hasn't changed, and so I don't think there'll be a change in policy from that perspective.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, I think the White House has been will remain firm in their resolute support for Ukraine, as indeed we will in the United Kingdom. I mean, I'm sure the Congress can cause problems on some of the budget decisions, but in terms of foreign policy, I do not anticipate it changing.
And Donald Trump running for the presidency, making a big announcement soon?
I think we'll have to wait and see.
Jonathan, is it something you will be looking out for closely?
Well, of course. I mean, we all love to follow US politics, don't we, in the UK? So I'll definitely be watching out for it. But I suspect him and his supporters will be disappointed by this set of results.
Well, obviously, we're going to get the full set of results over the coming days, but possibly not weeks until December. But that's all we have time for. Thank you to both of my guests for joining me here today. That was the third Prime Minister's Questions for Rishi Sunak across the dispatch box from Keir Starmer. Politics Live will be back tomorrow at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.
Yeah, anywho. I was bored for that streamer. Later today though, tonight, question time. So put your bell on and don't, so you get notification. It will be on 10:30, something like that, 11:15 or 22, depends. Sometimes it's 10:30, sometimes it's 22. Anywho, enjoy the rest of whatever time zone you're in.